In February 1944, a lone German bomber allegedly slipped within 12 miles of New York City, photographed Long Island, and vanished into legend. Germany never had the fleet to follow it up. This is the backward story of how one general's death in 1936, and a checklist he never finished, doomed the Third Reich's only real chance to ever seriously threaten America itself. Chapter 1. The flight probably never happened start here, because this is the moment the whole story secretly hinges on. Early 1944, somewhere over the frigid North Atlantic, a six-engine giant of an aircraft is supposedly clawing its way west, running on fumes and nerve, according to post-war interrogation reports. Reports nobody has ever been able to fully confirm, and reports serious historians still argue about to this day. A lone Junkers Ju 390 flew a round trip of more than 32 hours, slipped past Allied radar and patrol aircraft, and came close enough to the American coast to photograph Long Island. Some versions of the story put it a mere 12 miles from the skyline of New York City itself. No wreckage, no confirmed photographs, no corroborating flight log has ever surfaced, and yet the story refuses to die because it is almost believable, and that almost is the whole point of this video. Here's the paradox we're going to unpack today. If the story is even partly true, it means that at the exact moment the United States was pouring an ocean of steel and aluminum across the Atlantic to annihilate Nazi Germany, a German bomber may have quietly looked back at America and realized there was absolutely nothing Germany could actually do about it. One overloaded, jury-rigged prototype sneaking a look at a coastline is not a bombing campaign. It's not even a threat. It's a ghost story, a very expensive ghost story, built from a strategic mistake made 8 years earlier, in a quiet argument between two men who never got the chance to finish it. To understand why Nazi Germany, one of the most technologically aggressive and industrially formidable war machines in history, ended the Second World War without ever fielding a single true four-engine strategic bomber fleet, without ever being able to seriously threaten the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, let alone the continental United States, we have to rewind. Not to 1944, not even to 1939, we have to go back to 1935, to a decision that was never really made, because the man pushing for it died before he could make his case one final time. This is the story of the Amerikabomber program, the crash project born nearly a decade too late. Built on airframes that were never meant for the job, chasing a dream that a dead general had already understood was essential, back when there was still time to build it properly. Chapter 2: Two Visions for One Air Force. Rewind to 1935. Adolf Hitler has just publicly torn up the Treaty of Versailles restrictions on German air power and revealed to the world, quite openly now, that the Luftwaffe exists. Germany is rearming in full view of Europe, daring anyone to object with more than a diplomatic protest. And in Berlin, a brand new air ministry has to answer a question that will define the next decade of German air power. What exactly is this Air Force actually for? There were, in essence, two competing visions, embodied by two very different men. The first vision belonged to Hermann Göring, the flamboyant World War I flying ace turned political power broker, now head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most powerful men in the Third Reich. Göring's instincts were shaped by the culture around him. Hitler's foreign policy was built on speed, on shock, on presenting Europe with a series of fates accompli before anyone could organize a response. Göring wanted an air force to match that temperament, fast, agile, devastating at short range. Dive bombers that could support advancing tanks, medium bombers that could flatten a city in days, not weeks, fighters that could win air superiority over a battlefield a few hundred miles from a German airbase. This was the doctrine that would come to be known, informally, almost accidentally, as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Hit fast, hit hard, hit close, and win before the enemy can even fully mobilize. It's a seductive doctrine, because in the short term, it is going to look absolutely correct. The second vision belonged to a much quieter, far more intellectually serious man, General Walther Wever, the first chief of staff of the new Luftwaffe. Wever was not a pilot by background. He came from the Army General Staff, but he had studied air power theory more deeply than almost anyone else in the German military, and he had arrived at a conclusion that unsettled the men around him. Wever argued that a war, fought only with short-range tactical air power, was a war that could never be finished on Germany's terms. If Germany ever found itself at war with a truly massive industrial power, and he specifically worried about both the Soviet Union and the United States, then tactical air superiority over a battlefield would mean nothing. The enemy's factories, foundries, refineries, and shipyards would sit untouched, thousands of miles behind the front, endlessly generating new tanks, new aircraft, new artillery shells to replace whatever Germany destroyed at the front that week. Wever's answer was what came to be nicknamed the Ural bomber, a genuine four-engine heavy bomber, comparable in ambition to what Britain and the United States would later build, capable of reaching from German airfields all the way to the industrial centers beyond the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, or, in the most extreme version of his thinking, capable of one day reaching the eastern seaboard of the United States. Two prototype programs were quietly moving forward under his direction, the Dornier Do-19 and the Junkers Ju-89, both slow, ungainly, underpowered by the standards of what would come later, but both were real attempts at building a genuine strategic bomber fleet, years before Germany's enemies would field their own. For a brief window in the mid-1930s, Germany had a two-track air force in development: Göring's fast tactical strike force and Wever's slow but strategic heavy bomber fleet. Both men were, in their own way, right. The tragedy is that only one of them would live long enough to keep arguing his case. It's worth pausing on just how seriously Wever's staff had already taken this problem. The Dornier Do-19 and Junkers Ju-89 weren't just paper studies, they were real, flying prototypes, lumbering four-engine machines that looked almost primitive next to the fighters, and dive bombers stealing the spotlight elsewhere in the Luftwaffe's development budget. They were underpowered, they were slow, judged purely as bombers. They would likely have needed years of further refinement before they could carry a war-winning bomb load across genuinely strategic distances. But that misses the point entirely. What mattered wasn't whether the Do-19 or Ju-89 themselves were war-winning weapons. What mattered was that Germany had, for a few short years, an institutional commitment to solving the four-engine heavy bomber problem, while there was still time to solve it properly, with dedicated engine development, dedicated crew training, and a production base that hadn't yet been diverted entirely toward the short-range Blitzkrieg force. Wever wasn't just building two prototypes. He was building an organizational habit of thinking in strategic terms, a habit that, once broken, Germany would spend the rest of the war unable to fully recover. Chapter 3, The Crash That Canceled Astrology. On June 3, 1936, General Walther Wever was flying to Dresden to give a speech. Before boarding, in a rush, he skipped his own aircraft's pre-flight checklist, specifically, a step that would have caught a simple but fatal error: the aircraft's aileron locks, fitted to keep the control surfaces from flapping in the wind while parked, had not been removed. Wever took off anyway, within moments of leaving the ground, with the ailerons still locked and the aircraft unable to bank or correct. The plane rolled and crashed. Wever and his mechanic were killed instantly. It's one of those small, almost embarrassingly mundane accidents that historians love to point to as a hinge point in world events, and in this case, the case is genuinely strong. Wever was more than a bureaucrat pushing a pet project. He was the single most influential voice inside the German military, insisting that Germany needed real strategic depth in the air, the ability to strike an enemy's economy, not just its army. He was, by multiple accounts, actively persuasive, politically skilled enough to keep Göring and the wider Luftwaffe leadership at least tolerant of the heavy bomber program, even though it wasn't Göring's personal priority. Wever's death removed the one person capable of defending that vision at the highest levels. His successors were men far more aligned with Göring's instincts. Men who looked at the Ural bomber program and saw slow, expensive, resource-hungry aircraft that competed directly for engines, aluminum, and factory capacity against the fast tactical bombers and fighters that Göring wanted built in bulk, immediately. Within roughly a year of Wever's death, both the Dornier Do-19 and Junkers Ju-89 programs were effectively cancelled. Germany would enter the most destructive war in human history without a single operational four-engine heavy bomber in its arsenal. And, more importantly, without an Air Force doctrine that had ever seriously planned for one. This is the moment the entire Amerikabomber saga is rewinding from. Everything that comes later, the frantic civilian airliner conversions, the underpowered prototypes, the six-engined monster allegedly buzzing Long Island in 1944, all of it is downstream of a checklist skipped on a runway in 1936. Chapter 4. When the wrong doctrine looks right. Here's what makes this story genuinely tragic rather than simply obvious in hindsight. For the first 3 years of the Second World War, Göring's doctrine looked completely vindicated. Poland fell in 5 weeks. France, one of the supposed great powers of Europe, collapsed in 6. The Low Countries barely lasted days. In every one of these campaigns, the Luftwaffe's fast tactical bombers and dive bombers, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka screaming down on retreating columns, the Heinkel He-111 and Dornier Do-17 pounding railheads and airfields just behind enemy lines, performed exactly the role Göring had designed them for. Short-range, devastating tactical effect, total, overwhelming battlefield air superiority. Nobody in Berlin was mourning the cancelled Ural bomber in the summer of 1940. Why would they? Germany appeared to be winning a new kind of war, one where strategic bombing of distant industry looked like an expensive, old-fashioned irrelevance. Even the Battle of Britain, Germany's first real strategic failure, didn't fully expose the gap. The Luftwaffe simply didn't have the aircraft to run a sustained strategic bombing campaign against British industry, deep inland. But the campaign was framed, and largely fought, as an attempt to gain air superiority for an invasion, not as a systematic dismantling of Britain's war economy, the way RAF Bomber Command and the U.S. 8th Air Force would later dismantle Germany's. The absence of a heavy bomber fleet was a problem quietly deferred, not yet a problem that had been forced into the open. That reckoning was coming. It arrived, brutally, in the winter of 1941. Chapter 5. The winter everything changed. By the closing months of 1941, the picture had inverted completely. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, had punched deep into Russian territory, but it had not delivered the quick knockout blow German planners had promised themselves. The Wehrmacht was now grinding through a brutal Russian winter it was equipped for on paper and unprepared for in practice. Facing an enemy whose factories, evacuated deep behind the Urals, were now safely out of reach of anything the Luftwaffe could physically fly to and back from. And then, in December of 1941, the United States entered the war. This was the moment Walther Wever had specifically warned about 5 years earlier. A moment where Germany would find itself at war with not one but two continental-scale industrial powers, and would have absolutely no way to touch either country's actual capacity to produce war material. American factories in Michigan and Ohio, Soviet factories relocated beyond the Urals. All of it sat entirely beyond the operational range of every bomber in the Luftwaffe's inventory. Meanwhile, the war was starting to run in reverse. Allied bombers were beginning to appear over German cities in growing numbers, and Germany had no equivalent capability to retaliate in kind against the industrial heartlands that were making that bombing campaign possible. It's a genuinely uncomfortable position for a supposedly all-powerful war machine to find itself in, capable of devastating an army in the field within weeks, and yet fundamentally unable to touch the two economies actually keeping its enemies armed. Germany was strategically boxed in, able to fight, but with no realistic path to actually winning a war of attrition against opponents who could outproduce it indefinitely from behind an ocean and a mountain range. Only now, staring down that reality, did the German High Command scramble to resurrect the idea Wever had died trying to protect 5 years earlier. The result was a hastily assembled, chronically underfunded, endlessly improvised crash program that would come to be known, half seriously, as the Amerikabomber project, literally, Amerikabomber, an attempt to build, from a standing start, an aircraft capable of reaching the continental United States and returning home. Chapter 6. A project built on borrowed time. Understand what Germany was actually attempting here, because the sheer difficulty of it is the whole story. Britain and the United States had spent years, and enormous fractions of their industrial base, developing dedicated 4-engine heavy bombers, the Lancaster, the B-17, the B-24, the B-29, purpose-built from the ground up, with dedicated engine programs, dedicated crew training pipelines, and dedicated production lines, turning out thousands of airframes. Germany, in late 1941 and 1942, had none of that. It had a handful of design bureaus, a chronic shortage of high-output aircraft engines, an aircraft industry already stretched thin, supplying fighters and tactical bombers to multiple fronts, and, critically, no time. The Amerikabomber project wasn't building towards some future contingency. It was trying to conjure a transatlantic strategic bomber into existence in the middle of an active, deteriorating two-front war, using whatever airframes, whatever engines, and whatever engineering talent could be spared from more immediately pressing needs. What followed was less a single aircraft program than a desperate relay race through 4 increasingly improvised candidates, each one revealing a new way the problem was harder than it looked. Chapter 7. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor. A passenger plane goes to war. The first candidate wasn't even designed as a warplane. The Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor began its life as a sleek 4-engine civilian airliner, built for Lufthansa in the late 1930s to fly long-haul routes and set long-distance records. An elegant piece of civilian engineering meant to showcase German aviation prestige to the world, not to drop bombs on anyone. When war broke out and the Luftwaffe found itself with no long-range maritime patrol or strike aircraft, the Condor was one of the very few German airframes with the range to even attempt the role, and so it was hurriedly converted. Bomb racks bolted under the wings and fuselage, defensive machine gun positions crudely grafted onto a frame never designed to carry them, radar and reconnaissance equipment stuffed into what used to be passenger cabins. And for a while, it worked spectacularly well, flying out over the Bay of Biscay and deep into the Atlantic. Condors located and attacked Allied convoys that had until then felt relatively safe once they were out of range of shorter-legged aircraft. Winston Churchill himself is said to have called the Condor the scourge of the Atlantic, and the nickname was earned. Over the early years of the war, Condors were responsible for sinking or damaging hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping, at a time when Britain's survival depended on exactly those supply convoys getting through. The single most dramatic proof of what a converted airliner could do arrived in October 1940, when a lone Condor caught the RMS Empress of Britain sailing unescorted off the coast of Ireland. The Empress of Britain was no ordinary target. At over 42,000 tons, she was the largest liner in the British merchant fleet, requisitioned as a troopship and currently carrying hundreds of passengers and crew. The Condor's bombs set her ablaze and left her dead in the water, burning for 2 full days before a German U-boat finished the job with torpedoes. When she finally slipped beneath the waves, the Empress of Britain became the largest British ship lost to enemy action in the entire Second World War, sunk, in its opening act, not by a purpose-built bomber, but by a converted passenger plane, pressed into a role its designers in Bremen had never once imagined for it. For a brief, unsettling moment, it looked as though Germany might have stumbled into the Atlantic strategic weapon Wever had wanted all along, simply by accident. That moment did not last. The very success of the Condor forced the Allies to respond. And they responded exactly the way an industrial superpower, with time on its side, eventually does. With more escort carriers, more long-range Liberator patrol aircraft closing the mid-Atlantic gap, better radar, and better coordinated convoy defenses. Every one of those responses exploited the same fatal weakness: a converted airliner's fragile airframe and near-total lack of real defensive firepower. The scourge of the Atlantic did not evolve to meet the challenge, because it had never been designed to evolve in the first place. It had simply been the only tool available at the time, and once the enemy caught up, there was no reserve of engineering depth behind it to draw on. But the Condor's civilian bones were always its fatal weakness. Its fuselage had never been engineered to handle the stress of military operations, hard landings on rough forward airstrips, the added weight of bombs and guns, the violence of evasive maneuvering under fighter attack. Condors gained a grim reputation for literally breaking their backs on landing, the fuselage cracking behind the wing root from stresses the original airliner design was never meant to absorb. And once long-range Allied fighters and improved convoy escorts started reaching out into the mid-Atlantic gap the Condor had once owned, the aircraft's complete lack of real defensive firepower and its sluggish, unmaneuverable handling turned it from a predator into easy prey. The scourge of the Atlantic did not go quietly extinct because Germany chose to retire it. It was hunted out of the sky, one broken airframe at a time, by an enemy that had simply caught up. Chapter 8, the Junkers 290, closer, but still not enough. The next step up was the Junkers Juf 290, and on paper it looked like real progress. Also derived from a pre-war civilian transport design, the Ju 290 was larger, sturdier, and far better armed than the Condor had ever been, bristling with defensive gun positions and capable of carrying a genuinely useful load of bombs, torpedoes, or reconnaissance equipment over the ocean. It could remain airborne for as long as 18 hours at a stretch, prowling far out over the Atlantic hunting convoys, shadowing them, and calling in U-boat wolf packs for the kill. 18 hours sounds enormous, and for maritime patrol duty over the Atlantic, it was more than enough. But maritime patrol and a transatlantic bombing run to the United States and back are not remotely the same mission. Even the Ju 290's respectable range fell well short of what would be needed to cross the Atlantic, strike a target on American soil, and return home to occupied Europe, not without some form of aerial refueling, a technology Germany was still only experimenting with and never fielded operationally at any meaningful scale. The Ju 290 was, in other words, an excellent answer to a question nobody in 1936 should have still been asking in 1943. How do we extend the range of an aircraft that was never designed for intercontinental strategic bombing in the first place? It was an improvement. It was not a solution. Chapter 9, the Messerschmitt 264, built for the journey, abandoned by its engines. If the Condor and the Ju 290 were converted civilian designs pressed into a role they were never meant for, the Messerschmitt Me 264 was different. It was the first aircraft actually designed from a blank sheet of paper, specifically for the Amerikabomber requirement. This was meant to be the real thing. The engineering challenge facing the Me 264's designers was brutal in its simplicity. To fly a genuine round trip to a target on the American East Coast, a journey of over 9,300 miles there and back, an aircraft needs to carry an almost absurd quantity of fuel, and every single pound spent on fuel is a pound that can't be spent on armor, defensive guns, or bomb load. Faced with that math, Messerschmitt's engineers made a ruthless trade. They stripped the Me 264 down to the barest minimum. Minimal armor, minimal defensive armament, every spare kilogram of structural weight sacrificed to make room for fuel tanks. Because without the fuel, there was no mission at all. What this produced, in effect, was an aircraft that could, in theory, make the journey, but that would arrive over its target as close to unarmed and unarmored as a strategic bomber could possibly be, entirely dependent on stealth, altitude, and luck to survive contact with any defending fighter. It was a bomber built on the assumption that it would never actually have to fight. And even that fragile compromise ran into a wall Germany could not engineer its way around: engines. The Me-264 needed powerful, reliable, fuel-efficient engines to have any hope of completing its mission, and German industry, by this stage of the war, simply could not supply them. Engine programs were delayed, underpowered, and diverted to more urgent fighter and tactical bomber priorities. Only a handful of Me-264 prototypes were ever built, and none of them ever came close to flying an operational mission. Test pilots who did fly the surviving prototypes reported an aircraft that handled acceptably in the air, but that felt, in every sense, unfinished, underpowered on takeoff, marginal on a single engine, and entirely dependent on defensive tactics that amounted to little more than "hope no one notices us." Allied bombing raids on German aircraft factories destroyed at least one prototype on the ground before it ever flew operationally, and by the time a small production order was tentatively floated, German industry could no longer spare the engines, the aluminum, or the skilled labor to build them in any meaningful number. The aircraft that was actually designed for the job Wever had described back in 1935 arrived in a Germany that no longer had the industrial capacity to finish building it properly. Chapter 10: The Junkers Ju-390, the six-engined Giant, which brings us to the aircraft this whole story keeps circling back to: the Junkers Ju-390. Essentially a scaled-up, six-engine derivative of the Ju-290, stretched and enlarged in an attempt to brute force the range problem that had defeated every previous candidate. With a wingspan stretching beyond 165 feet, roughly 50 meters, wider than many airliners flying today, the Ju-390 was, without exaggeration, one of the largest aircraft Germany built during the entire war. Only 2 prototypes were ever completed. Flight testing suggested the aircraft could indeed achieve genuinely intercontinental range, at least in theory, carrying a meaningful payload of fuel, equipment, or ordnance across distances that had been completely impossible for every earlier Amerikabomber candidate. For a brief moment, on paper, in test flight data, Germany appeared to finally possess an aircraft capable of doing exactly what Walther Wever had asked for 8 years earlier. It was already far, far too late for it to matter. Chapter 11: Miles from New York. This is where we return to where we started. The legend of the long-range Ju-390 flight toward New York in early 1944. The story, as it's usually told, comes from post-war Allied interrogation of captured German aircrew and intelligence personnel, some of whom reportedly described a mission in which a specially modified Ju-390 flew an extraordinarily long round trip. Some accounts say as long as 32 hours in the air, crossing the Atlantic, approaching close enough to the American coastline to photograph Long Island, reportedly coming within roughly 12 miles of Manhattan itself, before turning back for occupied Europe. No confirmed wreckage of a Ju-390 has ever been found in a configuration consistent with such a flight. No verified photographs from the mission have ever surfaced publicly. No American radar log, coastal watch report, or intercepted transmission has ever been conclusively tied to the claim. Serious aviation historians remain split. Some treat it as plausible, given what we know about the aircraft's range and Germany's desperate interest in transatlantic reconnaissance at that stage of the war. Others treat it as a post-war legend, inflated in the retelling by prisoners with every incentive to make their captured aircraft sound more impressive to their interrogators than it actually was. Historians who study this period tend to split into roughly 2 camps. One camp points out that the Ju-390's demonstrated test range makes the flight technically plausible, that Luftwaffe reconnaissance units were genuinely interested in what American war production and coastal defenses looked like at this stage of the war, and that post-war interrogators had little obvious motive to invent such a specific, oddly modest detail as 12 miles from the city, rather than simply claiming a bombing raid outright. The other camp notes that no Allied radar station, coastal defense unit, or civilian observer ever reported anything matching such a flight, that wartime and post-war records of German long-range reconnaissance units make no clear mention of it, and that captured aircrew, humiliated, defeated, and eager to seem valuable to their captors, had every incentive to inflate a much shorter, much less dramatic mission into something approaching a Hollywood plot. Neither camp has ever produced the one piece of evidence that would settle the argument for good. And here's why the ambiguity itself is the most important part of the entire story. Even in the single most dramatic, most cinematic version of this legend, a lone German bomber slipping across the Atlantic, undetected to steal a glance at the New York skyline. The story is still, fundamentally, one plane, one overloaded, barely armed, largely improvised prototype, sneaking a reconnaissance photograph rather than dropping a single bomb. That is not a strategic bombing campaign. That is not the fleet Wever had argued Germany would need to actually threaten an enemy's industrial base. Even in its most impressive possible version, the entire Amerikabomber program produced, at absolute most, a ghost, a single aircraft that may or may not have looked at America from a distance, and then flown home again having accomplished nothing, except confirming that the idea was, technically, barely possible. Chapter 12, The Wanderweapons, Mistel and the Flying Wings of Tomorrow by 1944 and into 1945. With Allied bombers flattening German aircraft factories faster than they could be rebuilt, and fuel supplies collapsing under the weight of relentless attacks on synthetic oil plants, German engineers increasingly abandoned incremental improvement altogether and threw themselves at ideas that read more like science fiction than viable weapons programs. One of the strangest was the Mistel program, from the German word for mistletoe, the parasitic plant that grows attached to a host tree. The concept: take a war-weary, largely obsolete bomber airframe, strip out its crew compartment, pack its fuselage full of a massive explosive-shaped charge, and then physically mount a manned fighter aircraft on top of it, connected by a simple strut framework. A pilot would fly the composite aircraft to the vicinity of a target, aim the unmanned explosive-laden bomber below him at something valuable, a bridge, a factory, an Allied warship, release the locking mechanism, and peel away in his own fighter while the now unmanned flying bomb continued on, guided only by its last aimed trajectory, into the target. It was, in essence, a crude, mechanical ancestor of the guided cruise missile, cobbled together out of components Germany already had lying around because it no longer had the capacity to design and build a proper one from scratch. Even stranger, and arguably more historically remarkable, were the flying wing designs quietly being sketched by German engineers in these final desperate months. Aircraft like the Arado E-555 and the extraordinary Horten H-18, a proposed six-engine, long-range flying wing bomber specifically intended, once again to solve the Amerikabomber range problem, this time through radically superior aerodynamics rather than brute force fuel capacity. Looking at surviving drawings and models of these designs today is a genuinely unsettling experience, because their smooth, tailless, blended shapes bear an unmistakable resemblance to the American B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, an aircraft that would not fly for another 4 decades. German engineers working with slide rules, drafting tables, and a fraction of the resources their enemies had stumbled toward an aerodynamic shape that the rest of the world would not rediscover until the computer-assisted design era of the 1980s. The men behind the Horten designs, brothers Reimar and Walther Horten, were not career military engineers working inside a well-funded state design bureau. They were gifted, largely self-taught aeronautical obsessives who had been experimenting with tailless flying wing gliders since the 1930s, chasing the aerodynamic efficiency of a wing with no fuselage or tail drag, long before anyone in a position of real authority took the idea seriously as a war-winning weapon. That a design lineage born out of amateur glider competitions ended up producing paperwork eerily close in outline to a stealth bomber flown by the world's dominant superpower, 40 years later, is one of the strangest footnotes in the entire history of aviation. Proof that Germany, even at the edge of total collapse, still had engineers capable of genuine, era-defining insight. What it did not have, by 1944, was anything resembling the industrial base needed to turn that insight into a flying, combat-ready aircraft. None of it mattered in the sense that actually counts. Every one of these late-war flying wing concepts existed only as blueprints, wind tunnel models, or at most a single unfinished mock-up. Germany, by this point, had neither the factories, the raw materials, the fuel, nor the time to turn any of these genuinely visionary ideas into an operational aircraft. The only part of the entire Wunderwaffe, wonder weapon, program that actually reached the battlefield in meaningful numbers was Germany's family of cruise missiles and short-range ballistic rockets. Weapons that could terrorize London, but that had absolutely no capability whatsoever of reaching across an ocean to touch the one country whose untouched industrial base was, by 1944, arguably the single most decisive factor in the entire war. Chapter 13, The Bridges on the Oder. The story of Germany's strategic air power failure ends, fittingly, not with a wonder weapon, but with an act of pure, unmechanized desperation. By April of 1945, the Red Army had reached the Oder River, the last major natural barrier standing between Soviet forces and Berlin itself. Germany no longer had a functioning bomber force in any meaningful sense. No Amerikabomber, no flying wings, barely any fuel to fly the aircraft it still had. What remained of the Luftwaffe's willingness to fight found its final expression in volunteer pilots, flying whatever aircraft could still get off the ground, given a single mission: fly directly into the bridges the Red Army was using to cross the Oder, and destroy them by deliberately crashing into them. These were not trained kamikaze units built around a doctrine, the way Japan had formalized its suicide attack squadrons. They were largely volunteers, some genuine believers in a lost cause, some coerced by the collapsing chain of command, some simply out of options, given obsolete aircraft and a one-way mission in a final, futile attempt to buy the collapsing Reich a few more days. It did not work. Soviet military engineers, with the kind of blunt practical efficiency that had carried the Red Army from Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin, repaired the damaged river crossings within roughly a single day. The pilots who had died crashing into those bridges had traded their lives for, at most, a brief interruption measured in hours, a tragic, almost unbearably small return on the most absolute sacrifice a combatant can make. It is difficult to imagine a more complete inversion of Walther Wever's original 1935 vision. He had argued that Germany needed the power to strike deep behind an enemy's front line and cripple its capacity to make war. 10 years later, what remained of German air power could not even reliably destroy a single bridge a few miles behind the front line, and even when it succeeded, for one single day, it accomplished nothing that mattered. Chapter 14, The Question Historians Can't Stop Asking. It's tempting, and more than a little seductive, to ask the obvious counterfactual question. What if Walther Wever had simply removed his aileron locks that morning in 1936? What if he had lived another 5, 10, 15 years, continuing to push the Ural bomber program while Göring focused on his fast tactical force? The honest answer is almost certainly not the dramatic one. Even with Wever alive and pushing, Germany would still have faced the same brutal engine shortages, the same competition for aluminum and skilled labor, the same fundamental tension between building a bloated strategic bomber fleet and building the fighters and tactical aircraft that Blitzkrieg actually depended on in its opening campaigns. It is entirely possible that even a surviving Wever loses that internal argument eventually, worn down by a Nazi war economy that consistently prioritized short-term battlefield results over long-term strategic capacity. Germany's aircraft engine industry, in particular, never matched the raw horsepower and reliability of what Britain and the United States were producing by the mid-war years, and no amount of doctrinal conviction fixes a metallurgy and machine tooling problem. But there's a more modest, and arguably more important, version of the counterfactual worth sitting with. Even a mediocre four-engine heavy bomber program, kept alive and iterating continuously from 1936 onward instead of being cancelled, and then frantically resurrected from scratch in 1941, would have given German industry, aircrew training pipelines, and engine designers roughly 5 additional years of institutional experience, solving exactly the problem the Amerikabomber crash program was trying to solve overnight. Every single converted airliner compromise, the Condor's broken spine, the Ju-290's insufficient range, the Me-264's stripped bare fragility, was, in a very real sense, the cost of having to relearn from zero a set of lessons that a continuously funded program would have already worked through by the early 1940s. The tragedy of Wever's death was never really about one man's brilliance being lost. It was about the 5 wasted years of institutional learning that his death, and the cancellation that followed it, took off the table entirely. Years Germany did not have to spare a second time. Chapter 15. The Futile Miscalculation. Step back now, and look at the whole shape of the story we've just walked backward through. Germany entered the Second World War as one of the most industrially and technologically capable nations on Earth, and yet it never fielded a genuine strategic bomber fleet, never possessed the ability to reach out and systematically cripple the deep industrial capacity of either of the two continental-scale powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, that would ultimately combine to destroy it. This was not an accident of bad luck or an unavoidable resource constraint. It was the direct, traceable consequence of a doctrinal argument that was cut short in 1936, when the one senior officer capable of defending the strategic bombing case died in an entirely preventable air crash, and his successors chose the faster, flashier, shorter-term vision instead. For a few years, that choice looked completely vindicated. Blitzkrieg won stunning, rapid victories, precisely because Germany had built the Air Force suited to exactly that kind of war. But the moment Germany found itself locked into a prolonged war of industrial attrition against opponents whose factories sat safely beyond its reach, precisely the scenario Wever had specifically warned about, the absence of a strategic bomber fleet stopped being a minor gap and became one of the single most consequential strategic failures of the entire war. Every improvised, underfunded, structurally compromised attempt to fix the problem after the fact, the Condor's broken back, the Ju-290's insufficient range, the Me-264's stripped bare fragility, the Ju-390's lone and possibly mythical flight toward a coastline it could never actually threaten. Was Germany paying, in scattered, desperate installments, for a decision that should have been settled properly in 1936, by a general who never got the chance to finish making his case? The bridges on the Oder were rebuilt in a day. The bomber that might have reached America never really existed at all. And the country that built the most feared army in Europe went to its final defeat, unable to answer the one question that, in the age of total industrial war, may matter more than any other. Can you reach the factory that is building the weapon that is going to destroy you? Germany never could. And by the time its engineers finally understood exactly what that failure had cost, flying wing blueprints eerily foreshadowing an American bomber that wouldn't exist for another 40 years, 6 engine giants built a decade too late. There was nothing left to build them with, and no time left to fly them.